Oops, did I say that out loud? And so it's the sort of thing that you need to know enough about to stay out of trouble. But if you try to know too much, you're going to get into trouble. So let me help you. That's my job. So the first thing we're going to talk about is exactly what is a copyright and what does it protect. And the reason we start here is because now we know what it is, we know what the ground it is that we're going to have to contend over if we must. A copyright is used to protect something called an original work of authorship. And the devotion tonight was perfect because the devotion talked about the difference between that original work of authorship and making a copy of that original work of authorship. And the difference in value for those things is that the original, of course, is the creation itself. And while the copy is sort of an expression of that creation, it's not the same thing. And it could be getting in somebody's way if you do it without the right kind of permission. So what a copyright really is for an original work of authorship and the expression of the idea contained in that original work of authorship. The idea itself cannot be protected because there's zillions of different ways to say the same thing. If you look at every Sunday school curriculum from our own Spark House stuff to a whole lot of other people's curriculum, the whole plan there is to proclaim the good news of God in Christ, right? And the kingdom of God approaching. And yet, each one of those things is a different expression of that idea. And it's the expression of the idea, not the idea itself, that can be protected by copyright. The protections granted by a copyright so that the owner of that original work of authorship can gain the exclusive benefit of owning it. So for a period of time, whoever composes a piece of music gets to say, that's mine and you can use it or not, as I want to tell you to, or if I need to charge you money for it, I get to. And the most important protection that anyone has for a copyrighted piece of original work of authorship is the right to say no. And this is why it's not a victimless thing to say, "I'm not hurting anybody by making copies of it." You've taken away the fundamental right of the creator of the original work of authorship to say no. And so that's not fair. And so the law takes that into account. So if original work of authorship is to be used by somebody other than its creator or its rights holder, if that creator has ceded those rights to somebody else, the permission to use that content has to be had in advance of your using it. And that's a really important concept. Because if you use a piece of my original work of authorship and I didn't want you to use it, and you used it anyway, and then I found out about it, and I sent you a $5,000 invoice, you're going to pay me that $5,000 invoice because it's too late to walk that back. And I'm the owner of the original work of authorship, and I get to set the terms. They're not always that mercenary. And if you make an honest mistake, I'm going to forgive you right readily. And most people will. But bear in mind, if you use it without permission and then permission is required after the fact, you don't get to call that tune, but you do get to pay the piper. So do be a little careful about that. And the other thing to know is that just making the copies without permission is an infringement of the copyright. So just pushing the button on the copier, whether you use those copies or not. It's kind of immaterial if you don't use the copies. It's sort of, oops, and I'm correcting the mistake. But bear in mind, the infringement of the copyright happens as soon as you do it. It isn't later, it's right now. It's an immediate thing. And so that's just something to be aware of. It's not something to panic over. First of all, I'm not the copyright police. There aren't any copyright police. You have to go down a long, dark, and dusty road to get in trouble over this. But once you start down that road, if you get caught, you're going to have to pay. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Works no longer protected by a copyright are said to have lapsed into the public domain. The word is lapsed. I don't know why they decided lapsed. That's what somebody decided, and that's what it is. And those works are considered public property. We'll discuss various examples of what is and what isn't in the public domain when we get to talking about the kinds of things that we parse when we talk about what you put in your bulletin and the like. So don't worry about it. It'll become a little clearer. A quick word as we continue about questions you might have. Feel free to put them in the chat. What will be handled tonight are general questions for you. So we'll talk about the kinds of things that you need to know generally. What do you need to do to get permission? How do you find the people that you need to get permission from? But I don't want to get off into the weeds too far in terms of the specifics of any piece of music or any other publishing company. For those, copyright at 1517.media, and I'll answer those questions for you so that you get them as an individual and you're the one who needs that information specifically, and other people are not sort of being marginalized. So general questions in the chat, specific questions, email me, and either myself or my associate, a nice young gentleman named Sawyer Olson, will get back to you with the information that you need for those things. So the next thing to talk about is, how long does a copyright last? And this is where things get a little bit odd, because it's a lot longer than people think. First of all, there is a provision for the copyrights of things in the United States Constitution. One of the articles talks about putting things under copyright. It was for 7 years, it was for books only, but over time things have changed. And generally, as it is with people trying to protect their rights, those rights get protected for longer. So how long does it last? It depends on when the original work of authorship was created or put under copyright. Works created before 1927 have lapsed into the public domain. That's a moving target. As of January 1 next year, it'll be 1928. Works created or published from 1927 to 1978 are under copyright for 95 years from the date of publication, provided all of the right hoops were jumped through at the time, which is that they were registered with the Library of Congress that has a register of copyrights. They were published with a copyright notice that has the word copyright or the international copyright symbol in it and the year that they were copyrighted. And then under United States law at the time, the copyright was duly renewed after 28 years before the expiration of that copyright. If any of those above conditions fail to be met, the work is in the public domain. If not, then from 1927 to 1978, add 95 and go to the end of the year. That's when it goes into the public domain. Works created from 1979 forward are under copyright in a different situation. It's for the life of the longest surviving author plus 70 years. And because the United States signed a treaty, those works don't need to be registered to be under copyright. You no longer have to register your copyrighted stuff with the Library of Congress. It lasts for its full term, the life of the longest surviving author plus 70 years, or if it's a work for hire for a publishing house, that 95-year thing kicks back in. And copyrights happen as soon as the work is complete. You don't even have to put a copyright notice on it anymore. That's a difference as well. But if you find out that somebody has infringed on your copyright and you want to take them to court for it, that's when a copyright has to be registered in the United States. So in order to litigate, the Library of Congress has to have all the paperwork done. That seems like a really long time. And yes, it is. It's absurd. I tell people all the time that the length of copyright in the United States is absurd. Why is it absurd? Blame the Disney Corporation. And the reason you get to blame the Disney Corporation is that some iconic mouse thing was going to lapse into the public domain. And they went to their congressman there in Anaheim, a man named Sonny Bono. And the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act of 1998 was enacted and named for him after he ran himself into a tree while skiing after having a couple too many. And they thought, hey, pop singer, copyright stuff, great memorial. We'll name it the Sonny Bono Copyright Extension Act. And they did. But it added 25 years to the term of copyright, so that the length of copyright, that 95-year term, that's the same amount of time as you get for a patent. So that kind of made things equal, and it's probably not going to be extended again, because 95 years is an absurdly long time for people's great-grandchildren to claim the royalties from their great-granddad. So that's what copyrights are and how long they last in a sort of nutshell. And so now we're going to move to how it matters to churches about this sort of thing. And we're going to start not with streaming, which I know is what a lot of people are interested in. But we're going to start with your bulletin, because what you do when you create your bulletin is going to lay some rules down, some groundwork down for how it works when you go online. So when a church bulletin is printed, and if anybody's talked to me before, you might have heard me say this. When a church bulletin is printed, the church becomes the publisher of all the content of the bulletin. Now, the title of this presentation is How to Be a Weekend Publisher or Broadcaster Without Going to Prison. This is exactly what I mean about being a weekend publisher. You push the button on the copier, the bulletins start coming out the other end of it. You have published a brand new edition of everything that's in that bulletin. Anything in that church bulletin that is under copyright to someone must have permission granted for its use before it can be used. In reality, sometimes we deal with things after the fact, if we deal with the hymns licenses we have through One License or CCLI. But generally speaking, the idea is you're supposed to get your ducks in a row before you publish. You can get in a lot of trouble if you do it after you publish, or they start sending you invoices that you have to pay without being able to contest them very much. And that has, by the way, anecdotally, just to lapse into a story here for a moment, we have had people use images from things like sundaysandseasons.com that were rights managed images for the people who created the image, and they put them up on their websites without the permission of those rights holders, and they received invoices in the mail and were told, too bad, you have to pay them. And we got a good many panicked calls about that. And there was some education that had to happen and some careful planning and some work, at least with one of the two agencies that was sending people out by me, who asked for some forgiveness. And we were told, good, we're educating the people in the way they're supposed to be educated. We're going to let it go this time. And so it is possible to get yourself into some trouble if you're not careful by just grabbing things and putting them there. If it might have a copyright on it, be careful. If you're not sure, give me a call. I can't emphasize this enough. The current phrase when I started doing these webinars a few years ago was, I'd rather ask forgiveness than permission. And in the world of copyright, unlike perhaps the world of theology, that's a really bad idea. Because it can get expensive. I keep mentioning those invoices that can happen to you after the fact. That's an instance where asking forgiveness instead of permission can be costly. The things that in your bulletin that can run afoul of copyrights can be a little bit unexpected. Most of the time it has to do with music. And everything I say here about music in your bulletin also accrues to projecting your content on a screen. You're doing the same thing. You're fixing it in a new medium that is essentially republication. You're showing it in some way ephemerally, either on a screen, on a projection slide, or in your bulletin where people are turning pages to follow the service. What we're going to talk about now has a lot to do with that kind of publication. So here we go. The things that tend to have problems are the musical elements. So when we talk about music in your bulletin, we parse 4 different elements. One is the text for the hymn. You can't have a hymn without words to sing. And so the text is the first thing that, and the one that's most often reproduced in a bulletin. So if it's under copyright, you need permission for it. And when you think about hymnody, and especially thinking about the words, think poetry. And one of the things about that is they're complete works of art in and of themselves. They can stand by themselves. So excerpting them into your bulletin like that, that's a copyright issue. The second thing that we deal with are the tunes. You have to have a melody to sing a hymn. You can speak a hymn, happens all the time. But in order to sing a hymn, you need a tune. And that tune can be under copyright. And not coincidentally, it can be under copyright to a different entity than the copyright holder for the text. And that happens all the time as well. But a tune isn't the only musical thing that can have a copyright that can even be separate from the copyright to the tune. There is the accompaniment or the arrangement or the lovely chords that the organist plays or the choir sings while you're singing those hymns. There's a zillion different ways to arrange a hymn. There's a gazillion different accompaniments you can do for the same melody. Those different things can each carry their own copyright because they are an expression of an idea, which makes them an original work of authorship. So accompaniment parts can have a third round of copyright clearance for them if they're audible or if they're printed in your bulletin, or for whatever reason, they're not covered under the church's performance license that we'll talk about in a few minutes. That's a third copyright thing. And then there's a fourth one as if it weren't bad enough. And the example I want to use here is the translation of a text into another language. So the most famous Lutheran hymn, probably ever, is by some guy named Luther that the ELCA thinks is remarkably an important fellow. And it's Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. And if you want to sing Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, no problem. It's from the 16th century. It's long since in the public domain. However, if you want to sing that in English, you start singing A Mighty Fortress is Our God. And the text, as it appears in Augsburg Fortress's hymnals and just about everybody else's hymnals that have used this hymn, is under copyright to Augsburg Fortress because it's a new enough translation from 1978 for the Lutheran Book of Worship was the fresh translation for that, which places it under copyright. And so sing the German all you want, print the German all you want, no problem. Sing my text, print my text, you need permission. So 4 different elements that can have a different rights holder. So for your bulletin or projection, only worry about the elements that are going to be printed or projected. You don't have to worry about the arrangement for A Mighty Fortress if you're not printing it. You don't have to worry about the accompaniment for Earth and All Stars if you're not printing it. Different situation when we get to live streaming, but for the purposes of your bulletin, you don't have to worry about it if it isn't visible. Okay? Don't worry about page numbers or titles. Page numbers and titles cannot be put under copyright. So those are the kinds of things that you deal with when you're dealing with a bulletin. And you need to check your bulletin to see if there's anything that might have a copyright on it. Perhaps an image on the cover of your bulletin, perhaps some other things, but only worry about it if it's visible. Okay. Now we're going to move to the thing that has really driven everybody in my business crazy since about the 13th of March, 2020. That was the day, the last day, it was a Friday, as it turns out, that I spent as a full-time commuting employee going to an office. That was the day Augsburg Fortress sent us home and said, set up at home for the duration of the crisis. It's now February of 2023, so almost 3 years later, I still work from home at least 4 days a week. And I like it that way. It's a change in the way the world works. But what happened was everybody decided, hey, Palm Sunday's coming up, so we'd better stream our worship service. And the entirety of Facebook at 10 a.m. Central Time collapsed because every church in the Central Time Zone and a bunch of the churches in the Eastern Time Zone were all streaming their services all at the same time, and there wasn't enough bandwidth in the world for it. And then people started asking themselves, do we have a copyright problem? And the answer to that question is you well might, because certain things change when you move from doing a bulletin to putting that content online in a live stream. What literally happens is you move from being the publisher of the content of the bulletin to being a broadcaster on the internet, and it's a different kind of license. and there's more material that needs to be covered. And the reason for that is you may have put the words to Earth and All Stars in your bulletin, and you may have had a license for that, no problem. But you didn't get a license for broadcasting it on the internet when you live streamed it, and the tune is under copyright, and the arrangement is under copyright, and every other audible thing that is from earlier than 1920, or later than 1927, I should say, could potentially be under copyright. And all of those rights have to be cleared ahead of time. And so you have a possible copyright problem. So how do we deal with it? The best way to deal with it is to get a license in place that covers the content you use most of the time. And so we're going to talk about the licenses that you can get that will help you with close to 90% of the content you're probably going to use as an ELCA congregation. So let's talk about the first half of this lovely volume right here, Evangelical Lutheran Worship. Hope I turned it the right way. The first half of Evangelical Lutheran Worship, up to number 238, which looks like a hymn but isn't. It's a piece of service music. It's the Great Litany, is covered by the liturgies license that Augsburg Fortress offers. Okay, and that liturgies license covers live stream, podcast, projection on a screen, and print in your bulletin. It's comprehensive. And it's available through either a subscription to sundaysandseasons.com or as a standalone liturgies license purchase. We offer two versions of that liturgies license. We offer a liturgies license that is comprehensive and covers all of our liturgical content from Lutheran, from Service Book and Hymnal from 1958 forward to All Creation Sings, which just came out a couple of years ago. And then there's one that is specific to the Evangelical Lutheran Worship family of products, which is to say ELW and All Creation Sings. The full liturgies license is embedded in sundaysandseasons.com. So that's a comprehensive license for pretty close to half of a hymnal's worth of stuff. But when you go to number 239, and it says hymns at the top of the page, and that hymn is Hark the Glad Sound, and we arrive in Advent. Are you going to talk about what to do for preludes, anthems, and solos? Yes, that's coming. That's part of what's coming next in the hymns and songs and other bits licenses. So yes, we'll talk about that very shortly. It's an excellent question. So when you turn the page to number 239, and it's a hymn, our Augsburg Fortress Liturgies license stops, and you need to license the music from there to the end of the book, and pretty much any other music that you use in your services with other different licenses. There are two third-party licenses that can be very useful in this context. And which one is the best one for you to get is dependent entirely on the style in which your congregation worships. We're going to talk about the one that is the most common for ELCA Lutherans because Augsburg Fortress is a member publisher, and our publishing style is quite traditional. It's a license that covers the traditional spectrum of things. It's called One License. It's for the people who are sort of choir, organ, mighty fortress kind of people. It includes hymns, songs, anthems, organ music, preludes, postludes. All of that is covered as part of the streaming license for the member publishers who are participants in that license. With that license in place, including the content that is in the public domain, from 239 to the end of ELW, you're about 85% covered for that content. That includes music by Augsburg Fortress. It includes music by Concordia Publishing House, GIA Publications, Oregon Catholic Press. Okay, so the main traditional focused publisher companies in the denominational market are all one license member publishers. For questions and options, you can go to onelicense.net, click on options and prices. It will show you the cost for the print license. It will show you the cost for the streaming license. It'll show you the cost for the combination print, podcast, live stream, and projection license, so that you'll know what the prices are. Every one of those licenses is dealt with by the average weekly worship attendance at all services for you. So that's what you're going to do. If you have an 8:30 and a 10:30 service, you're going to add up that weekly attendance, and that's going to be the license level you pay for. For podcast and streaming, you'll need the podcast and streaming license or the combination license. If all you're doing is putting things in your bulletin, then you need the print license. If you're not printing things in a bulletin or projecting them on screen, but you are putting them online in some way or another by a live stream, all you would need is the live stream license. So look carefully at the type of license that you need to have. Okay. So that's the basic license that I recommend more often than not, because that's the wheelhouse of Augsburg Fortress, and that's the typical style of ELCA congregations, but it's not the only style. So there is a second license out there called CCLI, Christian Copyright Licensing International. If you are a band-led worship, praise band, rocking out to Jesus in the front of the room style church, bless your hearts. That's fabulous. People love it. It works very well for the places that do that kind of music. But CCLI is the license for you. And it's because they try to corner the market on that style of worship, and they do it really, really well. Augsburg Fortress is not a member publisher of CCLI. So our stuff is not going to be covered for you if you are a CCLI licensee. To stream CCLI content, a podcast and streaming license is required, and they sell it separately from their print license or some of their other licensing things. I am not nearly as familiar with CCLI as I am with One License, because I don't have a business relationship with them. And so I don't have quite as much knowledge of that. What you do need to do for either of those licenses is report when they ask you to report. And what One License does is ask you to report ongoing. And what CCLI does is they send you a notification every once in a while that says, hey, it's your turn for the next 3 months, please report your use. And then according to that use, that's how they parse out the royalties. So that's why it's important to report. Composers get paid more and publishers get paid more the more often their content is used. And so that's why they ask you to report. An important thing to note, if you are a subscriber to sundaysandseasons.com, we do not license the reproduction of any hymns. We only license liturgical and service music content through sundaysandseasons.com. And that's why you want to have one of these other licenses. But the reason for that is because we own almost all of the content that's liturgical in our hymnals, but we don't own even half of the content in our hymnals that is hymn related. We go to a whole lot of other publishing companies and say, love your tune, gotta have it. We went to Hope Publishing Company and said, love Lift High the Cross. Every Reformation Sunday, we want people to sing Lift High the Cross. And Hope Publishing Company said, no problem, for a fee. Then they came back with their next hymnal and said, Earth and All Stars, love it, gotta have it. Text for a Mighty Fortress, love it, gotta have it. And our answer was exactly the same answer they gave us, no problem, for a fee. So when you become a publisher or a broadcaster, you got to pay those fees. And that's what those licenses are all about. All right. Now, that's only necessary if you are doing things that are reproduction, fixing it in a new medium, printing a bulletin, projecting on a screen, or broadcasting to people who aren't in your building. Those licenses are required for those two things because they're outside the scope of what's called the church performance license. Churches have a really broad performance license granted by the law for the performance of literary, dramatic, and musical works in the context of worship services, which are live and in person. Got to have all three of those things for the license to cover you and not have to worry about it, which means open it up, sing it from the hymnal. If everybody's at church and you're not broadcasting, no problem. Now that license ends when the echo dies. And then you move on to the next licensed thing, which is the next piece of music or the next performance or the next liturgical dance or the next poetry reading by the pastor in pastor's sermon. It's site specific. It's the church building, but the church isn't just a building. The church is where people are gathered. So if you take music down the block on Easter Sunday morning and you sing tunes, you're covered by that live performance license. The reason being the church isn't the building. The church is where the people of Christ are gathered to worship. So it's a broader license than you might think, but it covers live musical performance. So live stream and podcast aren't covered, but neither is the use of a third-party recording. So you have a favorite piece of music by your favorite praise band and you want to pop it in the CD and play it. You have a performance rights problem because it's not a live performance in the context of live in-person worship. So you do need to be a little bit careful about that. The other thing that is an important thing is it's not for profit. So no charging admission. You can ask for a free will offering, but people can refuse that. So that's not a problem. Don't go charging tickets. There was a problem with St. Olaf College one year because they stopped saying that it was a voluntary thing to pay the $30 fee to get into the concert for the Christmas festival. And they started actually requiring that you pay. And then they asked me for permission to use a bunch of my stuff in their concert program. And they said, yeah, we're going to use one license. And I said, no, you're not. The reason you're not is it's no longer voluntary. You're requiring tickets, which means it's no longer not for profit. And you'd better get permission from all the other people who are doing things in your concert program. And they scrambled real hard and got that job done. The other thing that is specifically exempt, because this law dates from 1978, is video. VCRs, when I was in college, starting in a lot longer ago than I will admit, were $3,000 a piece. And that was about the same time the law was written. And so it wasn't thought it was ever going to be a problem. But now everybody can stream everything on their cell phone. So now video can be a problem. But because the law didn't account for that, and the law hasn't been updated since 1978, video is not part of the church's live performance license. So that's pretty much the kinds of things you need to know for worship. Now we're going to get to some of the other things that are copyright specific that churches do all the time. And the first one, and again, this became an acute problem in March of 2020, was how in the world do we do Sunday school? Well, we're going to have to put it online. We're going to have Zoom meetings. We're going to have to send people curriculum materials. We're going to have to think about how to reproduce them or to display them. And now what do? Well, a lot of that stuff is copyrighted, or at least the copyright is claimed, although curriculum, there's some real rules about whether or not you can register it for copyright. But the use of that curriculum online or in a Zoom meeting or reproduced in any way, shape, or form depends entirely on the terms and conditions of the sale of the curriculum. So in some of our SparkHouse things, if you're SparkHouse digital subscribers, or if you have some of the extra curriculum materials that have things like coloring pages, it will say right there on that coloring page that it's perfectly acceptable for you to go ahead and make copies of those things and distribute them. That's why we gave you the PDF in the first place. But other things, it's not specific that you can reproduce it. And it says in the front of the book, don't reproduce it without permission. That's when you can have a copyright problem. If you're in doubt, contact the publisher of whatever curriculum you're using. And don't assume that the purchase of a number of copies of a book allows you to make up to that number of copies of the contents of the book. That is the great urban myth of copyright. And it ticks like a watch. That is, the smart logic is, hey, I own 300 copies of this thing. I can make 300 copies of some page of it. And while that's impeccably logical, the law used a different logic, which was the original work of authorship that is expressed by you copying that page is the property of somebody who would have sold it to you as single pages if they thought that was a good idea. And so they have the right to say no. So if you make copies of that and they haven't said yes, you're in infringement of their copyright. So do be careful with the logic you use to justify making copies, because the law might have well used a different logic. If in doubt, call me. I'll explain it as well as I can. The other thing that is often a question or a problem in churches is whether or not the church has to abide by an important American law called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the answer to that question is churches are exempt specifically from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the fig leaf they put on that is that there is this separation of church and state, which means we can't, as a legal thing, tell churches what they can or cannot do. But the real kind of logic behind that was, look around your church. Is it possible to get a person in a wheelchair into every corner of your church without actually lifting that wheelchair bodily over something that you couldn't roll over? Do you have an elevator? Can you get somebody into the restroom? Are there all kinds of things that you need to do to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act? And if the answer to that is no, and if you were required to be in compliance, you would trigger the biggest building boom in the history of the Republic, and you would bankrupt about half the churches. So churches are exempt from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And where that comes in for copyright is schools can ask for fair use provisions to allow for the photocopying of certain things. Churches don't get to do that because it's part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. As a philosophy, as a way I try to administer intellectual property, we try to hew as closely to the Americans with Disabilities Act provisions as we possibly can for accommodations for disabled students who want to use our curriculum, but we're not required to, and some publishers don't. So we try to do the best we can, but it's not particularly simple necessarily. Then for the pastors in this meeting, I have had this question and I have had to explain to pastors that it has been litigated. And the question is this: who holds the rights to the sermon? And the answer to that question is that recent court decisions have held that the intellectual property rights for a sermon written by a church pastor as a condition of employment, say the weekly sermon that you are under contract to produce, is a work made for hire. And the rights to a work made for hire, which is because it was done as an expected job duty as an employee of the church, reside with the church, not with the pastor. This has been litigated. There's court cases that have to do with this. And so I don't say this to get anybody to worry. I don't want anybody to panic and say, hey, but I really want to own that stuff. I just want to say, as a condition of your employment, this is what's happened. And so it would be a smart thing, while your relationship with your church is really good, to say to the president of the congregation, hey, I might like to collect my sermons someday in a book or as part of a memoir. can we just say that that's okay and maybe put a paragraph at the bottom of my contract that says I can repurpose my sermons for personal use? And if you have a healthy relationship with your church, and I pray that you do, then that shouldn't be a problem. It's also not something to fuss over, fight over, or die over. It just is something I want you to be aware of. Then a couple of last things before we start taking questions, some silly things related to copyright. We all know the King James Version of the Bible, which in England is called the Authorized Version. And it's interesting to note that the Authorized Version of the Bible is perpetually under copyright in the United Kingdom by Act of Parliament back in the 17th century. And that's because it's the word of God as given in the Authorized Version, and really you ought not mess with it. And so they put it perpetually under copyright. You can't make changes to it, even though here in the United States it's lapsed into the public domain. But other more contemporary versions of the Bible might still also be on copyright. The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which is under copyright to the Division of Education of the Churches of Christ, the National Council of Churches, is under copyright as of its copyright date, which I believe is 1979. The new version of that, the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, which has just gone into print and will become the new version that they will allow to be sold starting in 2026 exclusively, is also under copyright and will be under copyright for a good long time. Other versions, the Contemporary English Version, the Good News Bible, lots of these Bibles that are mid-20th century translations of the Bible into English, those are under copyright. So you might check for the fair use practices. The New Revised Standard Version people, anything up to 500 verses is fine, as long as it isn't a complete book of the Bible. The minimum fine for an infringement of copyright is $200 per incident if you get taken to court. Now, 200 bulletins and you put my text that I own the rights for A Mighty Fortress in your bulletin, and I decide that you shouldn't have done that and I take you to court. 200 bulletins is 200 separate incidences of that text. Each of those costs you $200, it's $40,000. And that's, if you got a second hymn in there, that's another 200 incidents. But it gets worse. If you wind up doing it and telling the judge you don't care and you're going to keep doing it, and you get hauled in front of the magistrate enough times, the fines escalate to $10,000 per, and your 100 bulletins cost you $1 million. You must go a long way down a dark, dusty, awful road before anybody gets there, and it almost never happens, but it can. So I'm telling you that the size of the fine is inversely proportional to your possibility of getting caught, which is to say, small chance of getting caught, really big fine. So that's what I know in a nutshell about copyrights. And I think it's time for your questions. So who's got questions?
Cindy's got her hand up.
I've got several. I'll just take them one at a time and let other people jump in. What about translations of the Bible into another language? Does that have to be copyrighted?
It might well be under copyright, depends on who did it.
Okay.
And when they did it. So, a Spanish translation of the Bible done in 1810, that's in the public domain. A new Spanish translation of the Bible done in 2010 is under copyright.
By translation, you mean there's a change in what they publish, or they're just changing from one language to another, or both?
Well, what happens when you translate is you take an existing body of work and you put it into a different language. So the Bible itself is in a lot of different languages, from Hebrew and Aramaic to Greek and lots of things. So all of those, as they appear in the original language, they're in the public domain. But when somebody says people ought to be able to read that in English, in the 17th century, England decided you should be able to read that in English, and they did an authorized version, which we know as the King James Version. It's old enough to be in the public domain. The New Revised Standard Version of the Bible that most people read and that is downloaded through sundaysandseasons.com, that's still under copyright because it's recent enough. So it depends on timing.
Marcia, did I see your hand go? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, my question was what I put in the chat room. Is it true that during a live service, which is not recorded, is not broadcast, if the organist or pianist plays a prelude, or if someone sings a solo, that you have to get permission to do that, that is not covered under the church exemption?
Yeah. So it's not projected anywhere. It's not printed anywhere. It's not going out over the internet. It's just for the people in the building. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's precisely what the church's performance license is designed to cover.
Thank you. Thank you. And the last question I have is, what's a reasonable, right now I'm trying to get mechanical licenses for a couple of anthems because my accompanist fell and broke her shoulder. And so we have all the choir copies, and we have a young lady who can play them for us, but she's going to Florida. And so I've been able to get licenses and permissions for some of the choir anthems while she's gone, but I am patiently waiting for a couple of others. What's a reasonable time to wait for these permissions?
It varies. We try to turn them around at Augsburg Fortress as fast as possible. I know that for Sunday performances, folks at GIA and OCP and some of the and Concordia try to turn these things around as quickly as possible. But when I go to Oxford University Press to get permission to use a text, they tell me it's going to be 12 weeks.
Right. And what I'm finding is that even with one license is it may be on the list of publishers, but that really doesn't cover choir anthems. I have to deal with the individual.
It might or might not. That's right. That's correct. And especially if you're having somebody play an accompaniment, that's different than using it as a one-time worship thing that one license is best at covering. My recommendation, because I don't want to get too far off into the weeds, please call me tomorrow or next week, and let's have a little bit more thorough discussion about that, just you and me.
Thank you.
Mark, you had put a question in the chat box. You want to share that with us now?
Sure. I have a little trouble hearing, and I didn't quite catch the web addresses that you gave us for the permissions that we go to for ELCA things, and then there was another one, ECLI, I think you said. Could you just have somebody type those out or flash them on the screen or something so I can write down
Working
the
on it right
exact
now.
web address? Thank you. There's some of us are audio challenged.
Sure. I'm not sure what the web address is, but I think it's ccli.com. You can Google these things. And then once again, since you don't want to have to roll up too far, you can contact me at copyright.
You see those things appearing in the chat window, Mark?
Yes, thank you.
You're most welcome. Oh, and one more. The phone number.
Cindy.
How does someone cede their ownership of a copyright? Or is it of the entity itself?
Cool question. That's an excellent question, actually, by the way. Thank you. So what happens is the easiest example is, say, music publishing. And this is a paradigm that's shifting like crazy right now. So when we publish an anthem, typically what happens is we send the composer who sent us the anthem a contract that says, for the following royalties and the following due considerations, we'll publish your anthem, but in return, we will become the owners of the copyright. And the Library of Congress, where I go to register copyrights, calls that transfer by written agreement. So they sold it to us for due consideration.
Does that happen very often in church stuff?
Church music all the time.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we're a business.
So you can sell it.
We love to, yeah, exactly. What happens is the guy who writes the anthem or the woman who writes the anthem, they're not equipped to print 10,000 copies of it and get it sold. So they come to us and say, if you think this is good enough, here, publish it for me, and I'll take my 10% royalty or my 12.5% royalty on the sales of all that stuff, and I'll take my 50% royalty on performance rights and subsidiary rights, and in return, you get to register the copyright as belonging to you. And every time somebody pays you a bunch of money for it, I get my split.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's an excellent question. Thanks. I don't think anybody at one of these has ever asked that one before.
I have more, but I don't want to take up time.
Robin,
Yeah,
anybody else has their hand raised? Go
I
ahead.
see Robin's hand is up.
Yeah, first of all, Mike, we've talked before,
Oh,
and
hi.
and we've gone over a lot of this. I wanted to say a little bit because I think I'm the only one here who is on both sides of the copyright issue.
It's possible, yeah.
Within reach of my hand are my 1099s from ASCAP for my royalties I got this year.
Hmm.
And I'm also the cantor at my church, and so every Monday is the mad scramble to make sure everything's reported. So, and to find out what isn't.
Sure.
So this has all been very interesting, and it's most of it isn't new, and a lot of the reason it isn't new is having had a few talks with you over the phone. So thank you for those. But
welcome. I'm delighted.
anyway, it would be nice for everybody to realize that when you pay your licensing fees, or in the case of the people who use my music, who pay their ASCAP licensing fees, the money does get back to us. So in one way or another.
It does. Yeah, per whatever terms of contract you have with the entity that gets paid.
Yeah, mostly it's somebody will play a piece of my music and they'll report it, and then ASCAP will duly write it down someplace and figure out how much of a royalty I get. And that royalty is based on the size of the audience, mostly, if it's a performance thing.
Yeah, that's another reason why the licenses are always sold based on average weekly attendance.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you repeat that? You went black. I couldn't hear that at all. Your answer, Michael.
Oh, that's exactly why the licenses are sold by average weekly worship attendance. Robin said that he gets more money when the audience is bigger.
Oh, yeah,
And
okay.
so you pay more for a license for a larger average weekly attendance, which is logical enough, right? You're a bigger church, you have more pledging units, you have probably more liquid income. And then there's more people participating and listening. So that should be a bigger fee out of which the same percentage is paid, but it amounts up to more money the larger the church is.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I want to jump in with just a delightfully fun story about copyright. So about 11 years ago, we put TV monitors in our sanctuary, and we started projecting the words to Born and Cry. And there's something we had one license. I realized, we need to get permission from John Yvelsacher of New Generation Publishing. So I called the number on page 1172 in the ELW. And I actually talked directly to John Yellow-Socker, who was assisted living in Waverly, Iowa, where I went to
Oh.
college, had a delightful conversation, explained that we were going to, you know, for every time we had a baptism, we were going to sing Morning Cry and project the words. And we had a little conversation, and he and his secretary drafted a little contract for lifetime permission. So it was a wonderful, delightful surprise before his passing on to glory, to talk with the author and not be scared. And, you know, these people, most authors, I mean, they're not out to make millions and millions of dollars. So
No,
I
they
wanted
just-
to share that delightful
It's
story.
important that the work be acknowledged, and his widow Fern has continued that wonderful ministry. The nice thing is John licensed his stuff with a now gone license called License Sing, which then merged. That was Oregon Catholic Press's license, and they were in direct competition with one license, which came from GIA Publications. And they figured it out after a while that, you know, we'd all be better off if we merged into one thing. And so John's music is now covered by one license.
Robin again.
I would like to say one more thing about being on either side of the copyright issue. I too think the whole thing is daft and crazy, and there ought to be a better way to do it.
Good luck.
Well, good luck indeed, because it's the copyright laws have a lot less to do with people who use them in places like churches and people like me who compose the music or play the music than it does to the people who own big publishing companies and record companies.
That's
Which,
why there was a Mickey Mouse.
Yes, and
copyright
that's why it's called the Sonny Bono Act.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
So-
exactly correct.
No, go ahead. John.
I have a question, and I guess it goes back to the performance aspect of it. If a person purchases a particular piece of sheet music,
Mhm.
do they have the ability to perform that under that church performance, even if it's not something covered by one of these other licenses?
In a live,
Yeah,
in-person
you-
service only, yes.
yeah,
That's
okay. So
exactly
you,
what the church performance license is designed for. When it starts being recorded or starts being podcast or live streamed, now you run afoul of the provision of the license that requires that it be site specific. Because if your church in Michigan is doing that solo and I happen to wander by on a Sunday morning and go, wow, that's neat, I think I'll listen to that, I'm not on site. And so that comes out, that goes beyond the scope of that license. That's when you need one of those copyright licenses.
okay, that was, always my question is if you have physically purchased a piece of music, if you could perform it.
Yes,
In a
under the
live, in a
circumstances
live
for-
performance.
Yep. In churches, yes.
Yes,
If it was for a concert or a recital, maybe not. That depends on whether or not you are charging admission.
Mhm.
And if you are charging admission, then it's a public performance for profit, and the rights holder for that music is going to take a cut. ASCAP, if I understand properly, and Robin may be able to jump in here and inform me a little bit better, it's been a while since I looked. ASCAP will grant gratis use of ASCAP covered music for things like public recitals where the only money that's changing hands is a free will offering. So it's not public performance for profit. So they're not trying to get a cut out of it. But if you sell tickets, then any rights holder is going to say, you sold tickets, I've got a chunk of that coming.
I think that's right. In fact, I have a performance of 2 of my works in Chicago at the end of the month, and it is exactly that, in aid of the church where it's being performed. So I don't, actually, I think I granted them the right to use it anyway, because for one thing, it was my old church, so.
And, you know, the pithy thing that I often say to people who call me especially when they think that this stuff is ridiculous. And I said right at the top of the presentation, it's absurd. But the other thing is, as churches, we are called to model certain things. Or as I tell pastors who say, what do I tell my people when they say they're not hurting anybody? I say this: how do you expect the Holy Spirit to prosper your work and to defend you if you are engaged in theft? And not paying your copyright fees is a form of theft. So we want to avoid that whenever possible, because we want God to be pleased with our efforts.
Cindy, you had another question?
Yeah, and I apologize if you covered it. My sound is going in and out. It's kind of a combined thing. It's if something on the website, like say for Vacation Bible School or Clip Art, says it is copyright free, is it really? Do we take the word for that item that it's copyright free?
I hope you can, but you know, I think if you're going to find something like that, I would spend 20 minutes looking at the terms and conditions of the website that's saying it's royalty free, and just be sure. I can't make a plan. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. I can't say legally, I can't give you any kind of legal advice. My personal advice is, if you're not sure about the conditions that they're granting you the use of this thing, look carefully at their terms and conditions before you put it someplace public.
Thank you.
So I have an issue that I'd like to see if I can get a response for, and it has to do with choir music, choir octavos, the things you buy from Lorenz Publishing and so forth for a choir.
Mhm.
I've heard, and this may be, you could, if this is an old wives' tale or a myth, you can put it to bed, that if you order 30 copies of an octavo from a publisher, and they send you back a note that says it's out of print right now, but in 2 months' time, we're going to send it to you, that if you have paid for 30 copies and the publisher or the distributor is unable to deliver it in time for your performance, that it's permissible to make copies for the choir to practice or even to perform from until the printed copies arrive, at which time the copies have to be destroyed. Now, is that a myth?
It's not strictly speaking a myth, but it is one of those things where you need to be very careful. I would say what you would need to do, and what I do in this situation, which comes up with, it's not real often, but it comes up a few times a year. What will happen is we'll be out of stock on an octavo that we can't get to somebody. Say they made a mistake, they need it tomorrow. We're not going to be able to ship it to them in time, but we're going to get it to them in a few days, but it isn't going to be in time for tonight's rehearsal. We'll scan it, we'll email it to them. We will put on there for emergency use only, on order with publisher. This copy must be destroyed when the order arrives. And then it's fine. But then I have granted them specific permission to do that. And that's within my remit as the rights management specialist. Just doing it, you might run afoul of somebody if they get a little irritated about it. So it's the sort of thing where you need to say, okay, I don't have it. I can't get it. I'm contacting you for the permission to not screw up my rehearsal and the concert. So can I please do this? And they'll tell you to write pretty much whatever you need to write on that thing, and say, they should say yes if they want to keep your business. But it is really up to them. They're the rights holder.
So it's sort of a gray area.
It is like many things in this business, it is a bit of a gray area.
And one other thing, so back to the choir anthems that often are sung in churches. These days, most of those are getting live streamed or placed up into the cloud somewhere to be looked at later. There are a lot of publishers of octavos and of prelude music, postlude music. Is there any type of blanket copyright licensing, like One License or CCLI, that covers that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Or is it published by publisher?
One license covers you for the rights for the stuff by its member publishers. And
Everything.
Not necessarily. There are a couple of exceptions, and I'll mention them after I give you the blanket stuff that comes from Augsburg Fortress. If it has copyright Augsburg Fortress on it, on the first page of music, where if you're playing an organ arrangement out of one of our collections, check the copyright notice on that specific arrangement. We may have licensed it from somebody else. And if so, we don't own it. We just got the right to publish it. But if it says this setting is copyright Augsburg Fortress, whether or not you can find it at one license, I guarantee you it's covered. Because you'll send them a query about submitting it for use. They'll tell me that I need to check on it and I approve it. That's one of my jobs. That is not necessarily true for every publisher who is part of one license. For example, our friendly co-religionists from the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Concordia Publishing House, their hymns are covered. Their organ music is not. I can't talk them into licensing their organ music with one license, which would make them thousands of dollars a year. They just don't want to do it. Don't ask me. Don't know why. I don't think it's smart, but that's what they do. So it depends a little bit on the publisher. And one of the ways that you can do is you can go to one license. Just one second here. Let me try this and see if this is going to work. So can people see one license?
It's coming up.
There you go.
And it is one license that you see, not my emails?
Yes, correct.
I've got two monitors, so I had to make sure I was. So if we go here and click on member publishers, and we look for what they cover, you can see that here, a Catholic Teacher's Song does the podcast and streaming license. Everybody who's on this list does the print license. A Catholic Teacher's Song does the podcast and streaming license and a practice track license. If we go down and find Augsburg Fortress, podcast and streaming and practice track, we participate in all of their licenses, and our content will be covered by them. But some publishers, let's see if we can find one here. Most people are smart enough now to be podcast and live stream. Here, Capital CMG. They will allow you to use their content in print for a live worship service, but they don't participate in either the practice track or the podcast and live stream license. So this is a really clunky way to find out whether or not somebody is covered, but it's a way to find out whether or not their ancillary content like anthems and organ music is covered. Now, one thing that you want to do when you are looking to see if organ music is covered for prelude and postlude, do not, please do not use the first line of the hymn. That's a text. If you know that there are two tunes that are commonly used for A Little Town of Bethlehem, you know that hymn texts get set to different tunes all the time. So if you're looking for an organ arrangement of something, use the hymn tune name. And that will more likely find it than will the first line of whatever hymn that you're looking at. Another way to deal with it is to look in something like sundaysandseasons.com. And if you're looking for music based on a hymn tune or a hymn, and you're looking for something from Evangelical Lutheran Worship, like hymn number 401, and you go looking for it, and you look at the copyright information, you see that the text is administered by Augsburg Fortress, and we are a one license member publisher. If you want a tutorial on how that works, call me. I'll walk you through it.
Well, I was just going to say, we're coming up on the end of our promised hour and a half here. So I think
I got another 15, 20 minutes if anybody wants to stick around.
I suspect we're at a point now, though, Michael, where a lot of the questions we have, like the ones that I was asking, get a little bit specific.
Okay.
And
All right.
perhaps it
Well-
would be best if we repeat your contact information and encourage people to come and contact you directly with any additional questions they might have. How does that sound?
Fantastic. So it's going in the chat right now.
Okay, let's unshare your screen.
Yes, thank you. There we go.
There's our smiling faces again.
Going into the chat, there's the phone number.
Is everyone seeing this? You're all versed in looking in the chat window.
Yes.
Excellent.
Make sure I didn't have a typo here. There's the email address.
Okay, well,
If you email, please include a phone number, because as we've discovered over the last hour and a half, these are complicated and arcane issues. And so it's often better for me to talk to you so you can ask the questions that you have. And I'm delighted to do that. It's what they pay me for.
well, we certainly appreciate you joining us this evening, Michael, to scare the bejesus out of all of us.
Don't be frightened. This is not ground to die over.
But
This is
we're
ground to
also
just understand.
we're also quite happy to know that you're there to lift us up, if that doesn't violate the copyright of you lift me up song.
Well, thank you so much for having
Thank
me.
you.
It's been a
Thank you.
delight. I enjoy these an awful lot. And so don't hesitate to send questions. Either I or my colleague Sawyer will get in touch with you with whatever answers we need to give you. And we're delighted to help you.
It's wonderful to know that we have this
Thanks.
kind of support. Let's close with a quick prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the resources that you've placed at our disposal as we all try to do what's right in the world. Help us to have the courage to reach out when we have questions and the wisdom to know when to ask them. As we get ready to depart tonight, we ask that you send your spirit to each one of us and to the congregations of which we are a part. And we thank you for Michael and his time this evening and look forward to our next gathering as a group of leaders from the Synod. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
you.
Good night.